Hey, welcome. Today we are digging into a really fascinating and pretty critical take on the No Kings protests. We're going to unpack an argument that says, there might be a whole lot more going on with these events than what we saw on the surface.
So the source we're looking at today kicks things off with this really direct challenge. It basically says, hey, if you thought this was all spontaneous, you might need to think again. It really sets the stage for an investigation, asking us to look past the obvious and question what was really happening.
All right, so here's our game plan for this explainer. We're going to start with the protest's basic anatomy, the source's main claim. Then we'll get into whether this was really a grassroots thing or something else. We'll also look at what the source calls out as contradictions in power, dig into this idea of an unseen system, and wrap it all up with a pretty big question. Are we looking at a crownless kingdom? Okay, first up, let's get right to the heart of it. We're going to unpack the central claim from our source, this idea that these protests weren't exactly what they seemed to be.
Right, so the source makes a really important distinction here. It argues these protests weren't just some spontaneous thing. Nope. It's calling them a highly structured national messaging operation. It's not really questioning the passion of the people on the ground, it's questioning where it all started. It's drawing a very clear line between a spontaneous uprising and, well, a pre-planned, coordinated campaign.
All right, so let's dive into the how. If the claim is that this was some big, coordinated operation, how does the source say it actually worked? This next part is all about the mechanics, the real nuts and bolts of the movement, according to this perspective.
First off, the source drops a pretty big number to give you a sense of the scale we're talking about. It claims that over 500 plus different organizations were involved in coordinating these events nationwide. That suggests a level of organization way beyond just a few local groups getting together.
And, where you find that kind of massive organization, money's usually not far behind. The source follows right up by claiming that billions of dollars in institutional funding were poured into this effort. That suggests a seriously powerful financial engine was driving the whole thing.
And this right here, this slide really nails the core distinction the source is trying to make. On one side, you've got grassroots energy, spontaneous, local, popping up organically. But on the other side, you have what the source calls infrastructure, something that's centrally funded with professionally pre-printed signs and messaging that's coordinated across the board. The argument is that what we saw was a lot more like the second one.
And the claims actually go even deeper. The source alleges that some of those 500-plus organizations were openly calling for revolution. It also points to evidence suggesting that some of the funding networks could be traced back to global political players. And then there's this really heavy claim, an alleged alignment with Chinese Communist Party messaging infrastructure.
Okay, moving on. Now we're going to look at how the source tries to build its case by pointing out what it sees as major logical contradictions, things that just don't add up with the official story of the protests.
So first, we need to understand a key term the source uses, entrenched power. And the way it's defined here, this isn't about who wins a single election and sits in the White House for 4 or 8 years. No, this is about political power that lasts for decades. People who've been shaping the system from the inside for a very, very long time.
And here's the data the source puts forward to make its point. It lists these really prominent figures, from both sides of the aisle, by the way, who've been in office for 35, 40, some even over 45 years. So the big question the source poses is this: why all the focus on protesting a short-term king when, according to this data, this is where the real long-term entrenched power actually is?
Here's another one the source points to, calling it the voter ID paradox. It points out that, at the exact same time, proof of ID was being required for all sorts of daily activities, work, travel, you name it. But when it came to the incredibly important act of voting, that same requirement was framed as a form of oppression by groups aligned with the protests. The source basically says that's a contrast that should make you pause and really think.
Okay, now we're getting into the more subtle part of this whole argument. The source claims that beyond just the visible protests, there are these unseen systems of control at work, mechanisms that quietly shape what we're all allowed to think and say.
And according to this perspective, this control wasn't loud and obvious. It was quiet but really effective. We're talking about things like alleged government pressure on social media platforms to suppress certain information, sidelining doctors and scientists who didn't toe the line, even going after satire. The source also points to what it calls selective enforcement of laws and just a general weakening of what we think of as free speech.
So, how did we get here? How did this shift happen? The source puts forward this really interesting idea. The ground moved, not the principles.
It claims that basic positions on things like border enforcement or the legitimacy of policing, ideas that had bipartisan consensus 30 years ago, are now treated as extreme. It's like the goalposts of what's considered acceptable opinion have been dragged way over to one side.
And that brings us to our final section, which is really the climax of this whole analysis. This is where the source's argument comes together, and it serves as a final, pretty stark warning.
What the source does here is it lays out this kind of checklist. These are historical warning signs that historians look for when identifying authoritarian power structures. You see things on the list like the suppression of opposition, a disregard for the legal process, selective enforcement of laws, and this cozy coordination between the state and corporate power. The text then pretty much asks you, the reader, to look at all the evidence that's presented and decide for yourself if you see these patterns emerging today.
And it all wraps up with this final, really provocative question. The source brings its entire argument to a head right here. After all the energy spent protesting a symbolic king, it asks you to step back and consider a totally different possibility. What if the real threat isn't some person in a crown, but an entire system that exercises control without one? That is a powerful thought to leave you with.